So 2019 was a year that had a lot of promise for movies. Some big franchises were coming to a conclusion, and many of these films had some great potential. Despite all of this, most of these movies ended up being mediocre to just straight up bad. So in this video, I'm going to be listing off the worst movies I saw in 2019. And remember, this will only be movies I saw in 2019. I don't go out of my way to watch awful movies, so if you don't see some on here, chances are I was too busy watching paint dry instead. So without further ado, let's get into this video with the first one on this list being the first big disaster of the year, Glass. Now, Glass had a lot of potential as a movie. It was coming off the back of two great M. Night Shyamalan movies, Unbreakable and Split. Unbreakable is my favorite of his films, and Split was the backdoor sequel we never knew we'd get. The film had the perfect setup of David Dunn trying to stop the Horde, and Mr. Glass trying to manipulate the Beast into doing evil, and exposing superpowered people as real. However, the movie itself ended up being a huge mess. Where the first 10 minutes or so were really good, everything fell off a cliff after that, as Shyamalan tried to convince the audience that these two characters didn't have powers, despite two movies showing the opposite. Only for the end to be like, oh wait, they did after all, gotcha. It was a movie where Bruce Willis sat in a room for 90 minutes, and when it seemed like we were going to get a good finale, he subverted our expectations Rian Johnson style and ruined it all, getting rid of these characters in the most unfitting way and basically giving the middle finger to the audience who gave Shyamalan a second chance. After years of garbage movies like Lady in the Water and Avatar: The Last Airbender. But hey, you can't spell glass without ass, and that's what this movie was. After this movie, Shyamalan lost all stock as a director for me, and I have no interest in seeing any more of his movies. Unless of course they're on the bottom of bargain bin for 10 cents, and even then that's probably overcharging. Maybe if they pay me to watch it. Hobbs Shaw. Now this may come as a surprise to many of you, but I'm actually a big fan of the Fast and Furious movies. I've seen all of them in theaters since the original came out back in 2001, where it began as a standalone movie that was a modern take on Point Break, with street racers instead of surfers and adrenaline junkies. They've certainly had their ups and downs over the years and aren't exactly Oscar contenders, but they made an impact worldwide and became one of the biggest box office franchises in history. If there's one thing that Fast and Furious symbolizes, it's evolution. However, Hobbs & Shaw, on the other hand, is a straight-up devolution, a spin-off movie that exists so The Rock can attempt to hijack the franchise and turn it into yet another terrible, over-the-top Rock movie. And that's exactly what you get here, as this movie all but drops the cars and racing in favor of a buddy cop movie with an actual supervillain and aping off the Marvel formula, with The Rock and Jason Statham being the leads in a movie that is basically the dumbest Fast and Furious scenes in a feature-length format, where The Rock is pretty much a superhero without even being augmented like the actual villain. The whole movie was a high-budget ego trip, which is most demonstrated in the Samoa section, where they tack on an entire act just to fight the final boss with traditional Samoan weaponry, and you even get a rip-off Captain America scene, like in Civil War. We even see Roman Reigns spear a guy and do his trademark ooh-ah yell, as if it wasn't already hitting us over the head hard enough with how blatant it is. This movie doesn't belong in the Fast and Furious franchise, and I hope we never see another one. Terminator: Dark Fate. Terminator: Dark Fate is a movie that really should have been good. It was directed by Tim Miller, who made the first Deadpool movie, produced by James Cameron, the creator of the franchise and the director of its best two movies. It had Arnold back as the T-800 and Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor. And it was going to be a true sequel to Terminator 2, with them ignoring the other sequels and making a follow-up that longtime fans always wanted to see. But instead of all of that, we got another bad sequel that decided to pull an Alien 3, blow John Connor away within the first 5 minutes, and then make everything about its two female leads that were pale imitations of prior characters with little likability. There was nothing original about this movie. Much like Terminator Genisys, it ripped off every prior movie, taking elements from all of them and cobbling it together into a script that was worse than any of them, with constant plot contrivances, plot holes, and some awful dialogue that would make George Lucas blush. Then there was the terrible woke marketing campaign by Tim Miller, where he accused people of being sexist and misogynistic if they didn't support the film, or if they called out the obvious girl power nature of the marketing campaign. which is ridiculous because male Terminator fans always loved Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor, so he essentially alienated his core audience, which didn't exactly help at the box office because this thing bombed hard. This movie, if you want to call it that, and the others just cemented the fact that Terminator shouldn't be a franchise. It should have just been two great films, maybe some video games or comics, and nothing more. I think that's how most fans will view it in the years to come, assuming we don't get another Terminator after this. Captain Marvel. So Captain Marvel was the big hero teased at the end of Avengers Infinity War. She was the superhero that was presented to audiences as the key to everything, much like Jar Jar in the Star Wars prequels. The most powerful hero ever who would help the Avengers to defeat Thanos, and whose movie came out just before Avengers Endgame. So naturally, audiences wanted to see it, and this movie had some high expectations to live up to. But what we ended up getting was an incredibly mediocre, bottom-of-the-barrel superhero movie that is perhaps the worst of the entire MCU, which is saying a lot considering that Iron Man 3 and Thor 2 were among the list. It starred Brie Larson, whose performance was more wooden than Pinocchio, as she played Carol Danvers, an entirely unlikable superheroine who couldn't remember her past despite it basically being shown to the audience in the first 5 minutes. After crash landing on Earth, she meets up with a young Nick Fury, and has to go about figuring out her past and some other stuff I can barely remember at this point because the movie was just so boring. The movie was blandly directed and shot with a weak script full of contrivances, and featuring a main character who is pretty much superior to everyone around her at all times, especially her male counterparts, who are generally either dumb or evil. This was Marvel's first real attempt at wokeness, with Brie Larson hammering that in during all of the press for the movie, saying it wasn't for white guys, and playing all of the same cards that Lucasfilm had played with The Last Jedi. They even went so far as to change Rotten Tomatoes just because people were rightfully giving this a bad score. But it's all just Russian bots, right guys? This movie had little to nothing to do with Endgame, and was just an excuse to force this character into a story where she didn't belong. Despite making a lot of money, it's obvious that most people didn't care for Larson in the role, which is why she was barely in Endgame, and no one is really clamoring for a Captain Marvel sequel. And it has nothing to do with misogyny either, because most people are looking forward to Black Widow, Doctor Strange 2, which features Scarlet Witch, WandaVision, and over at DC, Wonder Woman. Almost as if audiences actually like strong female characters when they're generally well written and well acted. Who would have thunk it? Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. Now, I've talked a lot about this movie since it came out in my review and spoiler review, which you could check out in the top right corner of this video, but suffice it to say, I didn't like it. Rise of Skywalker was supposed to be the epic conclusion to the Star Wars sequel trilogy in the entire Skywalker saga, from Episode 1 to Episode 9. JJ had to give us a satisfying conclusion to 42 years of this franchise. And did he do it? No! Rise of Skywalker is a rushed mess of a film that completely bungles the ending of the story. During its over 2.5 hours of runtime, this movie attempts to follow up Episode 7, retcon events from The Last Jedi, introduce entirely new characters and plot lines, reintroduce the Emperor, try to convince the audience that Palpatine was behind it all, and try to wrap everything up. It fails at pretty much all of that. Every scene is full of exposition and contrivances that lead our characters from one side quest to the next, to get a dagger that leads to a wayfinder that leads to a planet that leads to Palpatine. And it's just one plot hole after another. Rey's not a nobody anymore. Now she's a somebody, which is just thrown in there early on with zero emotion or impact whatsoever. Palpatine is just alive somehow, with no actual explanation. Oh, and we see him within the first 5 minutes with no real build-up. So much shit is just thrown at the screen and yet you don't even care. So this entire film's runtime, I was either completely bored or just annoyed at what I was seeing. Carrie Fisher's inclusion was totally out of place, and the way that they handled her character's finale was just plain sad, but not in the way that they wanted it to be. And nothing about this movie feels like a true respectful or good finale to this franchise, which we all know isn't even the finale because Disney is just going to make more movies in a couple of years anyway. So we can't even let the corpse of this franchise lay in its tomb a few days before they prattle it back out for everyone to see. At least they're distancing themselves from the story now with the Mandalorian series and the High Republic movies coming out. Kathleen Kennedy will no doubt be fired or retire soon, which will only help matters. But if this trilogy was good and not this unplanned slap in the face we got, there would be no reason to distance themselves. And as bad as parts of the prequels are, they'll no doubt be looked at more fondly than Disney's films. At least until the 5-year-olds watching the sequels now grow up and start proclaiming that they're great in hour-long YouTube video essays. And before I get into my final film on this list, I'm going to talk about some dishonorable mentions. First off, with Cats. Now, I didn't see this film myself, and thank God I didn't, because it looked like a nightmare, and I wouldn't subject myself to that. But just based on the trailers and other reactions alone, it deserves to be on this list. The whole movie looks like a glorified fetish film for furries, and all copies of it should just be gathered up and fired directly into the sun, immediately. Hellboy's reboot. This is another movie I refuse to pay money to see, and should have never been made. Guillermo del Toro and Ron Perlman wanted to make Hellboy 3, which would have been the finale to their Hellboy trilogy. Fans were on board too, and given the superhero craze, this was the right time to do it. But instead, the studio got greedy. What a shock for Hollywood. They wouldn't give del Toro the money he needed to make it, and instead made this dumpster fire of a movie. Meanwhile, del Toro went on to win an Oscar for Shape of Water. Great decision, guys. David Harbour was the only good part of the remake from what I saw, but even then they messed up his look, and he's not the Hellboy that people really wanted to see. Now it's unlikely that we'll ever get a real conclusion to del Toro's Hellboy, which is a shame. This really is the worst timeline ever. Now, as for any other awful movies I saw that I'm forgetting, it's probably because I blocked them out of my mind, which is no doubt for the best. So with that being said, let's get into the worst movie I saw in 2019, which for me undoubtedly has to be X-Men Dark Phoenix. Now, I've always loved the X-Men since I was a kid. Growing up, I used to watch the X-Men animated series on Fox, played the video games at my local arcade, and read the comics I could get my hands on. So when X-Men finally adapted to the big screen with director Bryan Singer, I was excited. And upon seeing the movie, I loved it. Now, it wasn't exactly the X-Men I knew from before that point, as they were now more grounded, gritty, and wearing black jumpsuits instead of their real costumes. But it was a good start. The first X-Men movie, along with Blade and Spider-Man, ended up ushering in the era of good comic book movies, which led to where we are now. X2 was a great follow-up to 1, and was one of my favorite comic book movies for years. However, the series largely went downhill from there, with the disappointing X3 and the just plain bad X-Men Origins Wolverine. However, things took an interesting new direction with the X-Men First Class, which was a reboot of the story. And then when Bryan Singer returned, he brought everything back together with X-Men Days of Future Past, which was, in my opinion, the best X-Men movie to date, featuring the old and new cast alike as Wolverine time traveled to prevent a terrible future from coming to pass, eventually resulting in X3 being retconned from the story, to most fans' delight. The Wolverine was also really good, and so was Logan, which told Wolverine's final story. However, the mainline X-Men movies once again fell off, with X-Men Apocalypse being a disappointment, and then finally with Dark Phoenix, which was meant to be the final send-off to the franchise, and it failed even harder than I could have imagined. Most of the blame for this comes down to writer and director Simon Kinberg, who is also the writer of X3, which really shows because he basically remade the movie, both worse writing and direction. Why Fox would have ever given him the chance to do this is anyone's guess, but it resulted in this dumpster fire of a movie. With a weak plot, a continuity that didn't fit with the prior films, characters like Xavier acting totally out of character, no one having aged despite it being a few years before the original story took place, and bland generic alien villains who are basically just Skrulls with no personality. The ending was also reshot because apparently it ended the same way as Captain Marvel, with Jean flying into space and blowing up alien ships, but I doubt even that would have helped salvage this trash heap. This was the movie that was supposed to be the farewell to Fox's X-Men, a superhero franchise which existed before the MCU, and often stood as a strong alternative to it, but instead of a triumphant ending, it went out with a fart, and served as a big middle finger to both Disney and the audiences who supported it. Now Kevin Feige is just sitting on the X-Men with no new films in sight, and who knows if they'll even do it justice. If the new X-Men are anything like MCU's Spider-Man or Captain Marvel, I have a feeling that a lot of fans will begin to rethink the viewpoint of give everything back to Marvel. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. So these have been the worst movies I saw in 2019. What do you think are the worst movies of 2019? Let me know down below. Also, make sure to like and share this video out so we can continue to grow and bring you even more content like this in the future. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications so you can see all of my content right away when it comes out.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.